You found it. Your home for the best content on your favorite team, the Fighting Tigers of LSU. Do us a favor, subscribe to the channel, leave your comments below, and be sure to smash that like button. We got news on Monday that LSU defensive analyst Gerald Chatman is leaving LSU to take the defensive line coach job at Tulane. Matt Zenitz of On3 had the news first. Let's kind of follow this a little bit here and connect the dots if you missed it. So, of course, Jamar Kane was LSU's defensive line coach this past year. And in the middle of spring, Jamar Kane left LSU to go be Sean Payton's defensive line coach with the Denver Broncos. Before LSU could hire a full-time defensive line coach, there in the middle of spring, Brian Kelly promoted Gerald Chatman to be the defensive line coach. Here was Brian Kelly in spring talking about Gerald Chatman taking over as line coach.
You know, Coach Chapman, as you know, is a well-credentialed, experienced defensive line coach. So, you know, obviously he's coaching, you know, the interior defensive linemen during the spring. We feel great about that. And then Coach Jancic is coaching the Jack. So from that perspective, you know, we'll go through the spring.
So the other thing Kelly also mentioned, and I mean, this is, so you wonder why Gerald Chatman would leave LSU. I mean, this is why. So Brian Kelly also in spring talked about Chapman being a candidate for the job.
Yeah, we wanted to get through the spring. You know, we feel like we're in a great situation with Gerald Chatman, you know, on staff. So there was no like rush. We've got to go find a defensive line coach. He'll be a candidate for the position as well.
So this is the so Gerald Chatman followed a pretty bizarre timeline. So follow me here. So Gerald Chatman was in Baton Rouge in 2021, Ed Ogeron's last season. He was on staff as a defensive analyst. He leaves LSU after the 21 season. He was not retained by Brian Kelly. He goes to Tulane. Well, before he even coaches at Tulane, he's hired at Colorado to be their defensive line coach. Well, when Carl Durrell was fired at Tulane, at Colorado as the defensive coordinator, Chapman was promoted to interim defensive coordinator. So he goes, he's at LSU in 21. That offseason, he leaves for Tulane. Before he coaches at Tulane, he leaves for Colorado. He's the defensive line coach at Colorado. Carl Durrell's fired. Chapman becomes the interim defensive coordinator at Colorado. They hire Deion Sanders. Chapman is not retained. He goes back to LSU as an analyst. Now, Jamar Kane leaves. He's promoted to interim defensive line coach. Well, ultimately, Brian Kelly hires Jimmy Lindsey to be the defensive line coach. So Chapman was going to be relegated to being an analyst for another season, or for this season, which was the role he was hired to be in. Just he thought he'd have a chance maybe to be elevated. And then Tulane comes in and says, hey, you want to run it back and be our defensive line coach? So Chapman's leaving LSU now to go be the defensive line coach at Tulane. If you remember a couple of weeks ago, we had Pete Jenkins on the show, and he raved about Gerald Chatman, kind of from that school, that old school of coaching interior defensive linemen. But so is Jimmy Lindsey. And remember, Matt House and Jimmy Lindsey have history together. That's the defensive line coach that LSU hired. Jimmy Lindsey and Matt House worked together at Gardner-Webb in 2005. So they've got some synergies and some history. And that was the thing that Pete Jenkins really stressed to us when we talked about it was last year with Jamar Kane, and Jamar Kane's a great defensive line coach. He and Matt House just have a different way of doing things. And like continuity on staff matters. You know, having everybody, if you're the defensive coordinator, the offensive coordinator, having everybody on your staff aligned with how you want things done and taught matters. So Jamar Kane leaving, this was Coach Pete's theory, would actually be sort of an upgrade for LSU because you're going to bring in someone who knows Matt House's expectations, so everyone's just more aligned. And that's Jimmy Lindsey. So that means Gerald Chatman is kind of on the outside looking in. But you understand if you're LSU, if you're Brian Kelly, why Gerald Chatman is going to leave. He's going to leave to go have an on-field coaching opportunity. You know, you went through spring and he stepped up and had an on-field opportunity. Brian Kelly said he was going to be considered for it and for the full-time job. And ultimately they went a different direction and hired Jimmy Lindsey. So Gerald Chatman leaves and goes to Tulane. So Gerald Chatman who spends just 4 months in Baton Rouge in his second stint, is now headed to Tulane to be their on-field defensive line coach. So Brian Kelly down an analyst on his defensive staff. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Please leave your comments. I love to interact, and be sure to hit the red subscribe button below.